Okay, awesome. We are all good to go. And I will end my speech on my first in just a moment. Inside proposition, we think that the pitch represents more than just a football match. It is a terrain that represents the histories, identities, and narratives that shape the experience of playing on behalf of a nation. Our stance is really clear. We think players deserve the dignity of being cherished and venerated by the nations that they play for as they leave everything on the pitch. We are very, very proud to propose. A few things to note in terms of framing before then two substantive arguments. First on a principle, and second on why this improves international play greatly. The first thing to note is that in this motion, when confronted with the choice, our side supports choosing country of lineage over country of both, over country of birth. Notably, this means that this choice must be possible for players, meaning the debate is not about stars or disproportionately isn't about like kinds of players who tend to be locked into playing for whatever country they've been with for like an extended amount of time because of things like FIFA regulations or federation regulations. The second thing to note is as far as what the comparative in the debate is. We think our proposition, the majority of European players of African descent choose to represent their African country of lineage, whereas on opposition, the majority of European players of African descent choose to represent their birth European country. Note
Clarification.
it's a choice on either side. The debate is about what we in the room believe that these players should choose. First argument, then, as far as the principle. We think the characterization here is really, really simple. There is a huge history of colonialism that has ultimately shaped where these players land and which European nations they end up representing in international play. And even if opposition says that families may move for legitimate reasons, for instance, jobs or quality of life, these reasons are ultimately shaped in the context of the lasting harms brought forth by colonialism, which means the way that this manifests in
Clarification.
international sporting is a complete lack of legitimacy for African nations. What specific implications does this have on players' choice to represent Europe? First is that we would argue that this choice is fundamentally coercive because they don't want to play for less legitimate nations or nations that are perceived as less legitimate. And note that diaspora players have likely grown up around this kind of rhetoric as well, which shapes their implicit bias against African nations. The second thing to note is that African nations often have little to no leveraging or bargaining power. This looks like the fact that European teams can outspend, outtrain, have early recruitment pipelines because of pre-existing sports infrastructure and things like this. The last thing to note here, though, is that the popular will to create robust things like this in Africa is completely missing. And arguably, there's some level of internalization by African countries themselves that they can never
Point of
compete. So there's
information.
fundamentally no point to actually invest in the sports infrastructure. There's also a huge pressure to conform because diaspora players fear being branded, so they won't. So even if they do want to play for an African country, for instance, they oftentimes don't. Even if opposition managed to prove that this choice isn't coercive, we still think there's a huge practical implication here as well, in that players experience far more moments of discomfort, trauma, and or cognitive dissonance while playing for Europe than while representing their African nations. For instance, you deal with things like racist refereeing, racist crowd chants, fickle fan support, and teammates who don't defend you in the instances of like racial microaggressions or macroaggressions or things like this, right? The reason why this is so bad, principally, is that players ultimately are treated as means to ends when they represent these European teams. They have their dignity actively assaulted because these players are only ever supported very, very conditionally. And the dignities of these players on the pitch matter a lot more than any kind of like nebulous, pragmatic
Point of
harm about like
information.
team success or no longer being successful in competitive sports. The reason this is the case is because bigoted behavior often translates into real life harm, right? It creates additional injustice. For instance, like rates of domestic violence going up after England loses like international player international matches. The second thing, though, is that we think there is a huge amount of complicity in these players representing European teams because they often perpetuate racist and colonialist narratives. The presence of European players of African descent on European teams sport washes the legacies and the impacts of these teams, despite the team's fans often perpetuating racist narratives and politics like Europe for Europeans. The countries can point to their diverse team and
Point of
superficial unity
information.
as proof of fact that the country is not racist. I'll take you at the bottom of the principle. Whether the players intend for this to occur or not, their presence on this team strengthens these narratives. Thus, choosing to represent their African nations would avoid complicity in this harm. The third and final thing to note is that complicity is worsening colonial divide within sports because there's a huge power asymmetry between African countries and European nations. This is obviously zero sum, right? The national players that are associated with European national teams are often not associated with their African heritage. Their name, image, and likeness is completely absorbed by their association with the European national team. And this correlates with undermining African legitimacy because players with ethnic ties to African countries are often influenced by African or ethnic ways of playing that get massive acclaim and become culturally significant in the sport. For instance, things like African street ball. But The cultural capital is reinvesting into European sports writ large. The interlink here is really, really simple. Even if you're in a different country, all of your familiar cultural traditions live through family. They live through things like your social economic positioning. So you probably grew up with other second generation immigrants who help to keep the culture alive. On opposition sides, European teams say that they play soccer the right way. For example, looking at Hurricanes' criticisms of Ghana after their draw with these teams. Before moving on to the weighing this argument, though, I'll take the POI from opposition.
What about Lamine Yamal, whose parents are from Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon, is not European enough for you, even though he grew up in Spain?
Right. This it's not it's that Lamine Yamal when he doesn't do well is perceived as not European enough, and that kind of weaponization is what leads to like a less enjoyable experience for a player like Lamine Yamal. That's exactly what we're arguing. Two things to know as far as weighing. First, the complicity compounds to conditions that not only hurt the specific player, but create conditions that extend into a multitude of players, right? So it creates an atmosphere that is just hostile for all players of African lineage. And second, opposition's offense is drawn from players making choices under fundamentally coercive conditions. To the extent in which it is true, players who choose European teams instead of African teams isn't an actually generally autonomous choice and a real revealed preference. Second argument on why this is just better for the sport writ large. The characterization here is really simple. International leagues are currently uncompetitive for a few reasons. Firstly, European nations monopolize a limited pool of talent from the global south, and secondly, they just have way more resources. But the thing is that the amount of players that can actually play on a European team and make a sizable impact on this team is finite. And the reason is because federations often have an incentive to recruit and retain talent, not because they are better than these players, but because they know other teams are worse off without these players. For instance, the fourth best striker for France probably doesn't mean much to France because they have a bench that can literally be a round of 16 team alone, but it can literally change the course of a team
Point
like
of
Algeria, who didn't
information.
have as much capital to invest in their development in the first place. The comparative is players choosing to represent African countries, which means the player who maybe gets neglected in the opposition world now gets more athletic opportunities, more visibility, and chance for sponsorships. There are three huge benefits as far as what this applies to in regards to international play. Firstly, on the players themselves. One, players are likely to experience far less racism, and the problem and the reason this is true is because often fans of European nations place a large deal of conditionality on accepting players depending on their performance, which translates to just a bunch of like racist vitriolic hate. The second thing is that the comparative is that African teams historically have low finishes. They are the underdog. They are racially homogenous societies. There is a strong veneration and support for people that look like them and people that do their best to represent their cultures on a global stage. Second thing here is as far as team cohesion, because players are more likely to feel a bond with people who share their lineage. Because you may be born in Europe, but your customs, traditions, holidays, and food are always being shaped and influenced by your family and these proximate cultural influences. Secondly, on African countries themselves, when diaspora players play for Africa, a few things likely happen. One, this massively improves how competitive the African teams are with a star player or a decently average player with access to the best coaching and things like this. Because the comparative is monopolized talent on one European team, which becomes redundant at some point when your bench alone is already a super, super good team, right? The way in here, though, is that African players are locked out of competitive competition, and expanding access for soccer for more African players is more important than other arguments in the debate. One, because of representation, which translates to less xenophobia and racism, and secondly, because of how this impacts international competition itself by reshaping the balance of the sport and taking the concentration of talent, money, and other things like that that are traditionally in Europe and redirecting it back to Africa. For all these reasons, we are incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. I invite up the first opposition speaker, Erica, to continue this debate.
Underside Proposition's world, Lamine Yamal, a player that is of Moroccan descent, is not European enough. The problem is that even though side proposition tells you things that like colonialism and racism are bad, they are the ones that validate these very claims in the first place. Never so proud to oppose. In this speech, a couple of things. First, we're going to go down the clash of their two substantive arguments. Then I'm going to go ahead and introduce you some notes on framing from our side of the house and extend and provide to you our first two arguments. But let's look at their argumentation. The very first argument they make to you is about colonialism. They tell you things like movement being shaped by colonialism. But there's two main responses responses here. First, understand that their side of the house literally violates this idea of freedom of movement, because when people go to different countries like England, to France, to the United States, right? They're going so because we have this belief that people ought to be able to move, that borders are something arbitrary, right? But their side of the house says that no, you are not European enough, and therefore you must play for the team of your African descent. I think the problem here was the second warrant, or the second claim we give you, and it's the idea that they literally validate these anti-immigrant claims. They literally validate things that support colonialism and racism. You're going to see a lot of this analysis in our first substantive, so you can flag it for
Point of
there.
information.
But then, go ahead.
Certain European countries give people citizenship based on their line of lineage and not just their birthplace. Is that illegitimate?
Wait, even if certain European countries give them citizenship based on their line of lineage, it does not take away from the fact that their side of the house is validating claims that someone is not European enough if their lineage is something that is of African descent. I think that they're failing to realize that now people aren't European enough because of something as simple as their skin color. How far back do we have to trace our African descent to determine whether someone is more African than they are European? We see the same thing happening in the United States, where there is a big difference between African American or being black. Their side of the house is only going to validate these claims of colonialism and racism. On the second substantive, though, they talk to you about hostility for African teams and a lot on the practical level about how this is generally bad for African teams. We have two responses here. One, even if everything that they tell you is true, training with the French national team is better than training with the Moroccan national team. This means that the player can better develop on our side of the house, which means that they can be better on a club level. And as such, they can be more successful, which leads to our impacts of having role models and representation, right? So if you truly cared about athletes of African descent, then you would still prefer our side of the house. But the second thing was that even if this wasn't true, it's just violating the autonomy of these individual athletes. It would suck to be able to train in one country but never be able to play for them in the World Cup. I think that was the base level. But then, what was our framework? What was the framing you were going to see on our side of the house? We have two notes. First, we want players of African descent to go and play for their country of birth. This is what mostly happens in the status quo when Mbappe plays for France and not Algeria, where Lamine Yamal plays for Spain and not Morocco or Equatorial Guinea, and where Bellingham plays for England, not Ghana. But the second thing here is that the debate is not about clubs. It's not about who's going to play for Manchester City versus Real Madrid. The debate has to happen on an international level. This looks like the Olympics and the World Cups. But we provide to you two substantive arguments. The first one is on immigrant integration. Understand that side proposition literally screws over immigrant players because of immense anti-immigrant sentiment, and this doesn't just exist for athletes, but all immigrants in European countries and other countries. The first layer of analysis here is about how kicking players out from the team of their birth leads to worse immigrant sentiment. On visibility, understand that this is the largest, most global go back to your country that any side of the house could ever say. That kind of visibility is going to be really, really important into how this anti-immigrant sentiment is going to manifest itself. But then the second thing here is the concept of immigration is that if I go to a new country, I can create success for myself. This will show that it doesn't matter how much success you garner on their side of the house, but the ultimate determinant of things like your nationality or how you see your own identity, right, comes down to the color of your skin. I thought that was going to be ultimately more harmful for things like colonialism. It was going to be ultimately more harmful for the immigrants that they tell you are the primary stakeholder of the round. But then the third thing here is that now you're pitting African and European teams against each other because it reinforces color wars. You're not a European enough unless you've been here on our side, and also you're white. Understand that Jude Bellingham is the one who's scoring goals for England when it comes to the World Cup. He's the reason that they got as far as they did. However, Jude Bellingham on their side of the house still ought to play for Ghana because he's not European enough, despite the fact that he is attributing to England's success. US. The fourth thing here, though, is that proposition creates a narrative that Black automatically equals African, when that's fundamentally untrue. This then creates a world where proposition literally creates player eugenics. They say, hey, if you're of a certain color of skin, you must go here. I don't understand to which degree we're going to investigate someone's ethnical roots, how far we're going to investigate their ancestry and their descent, right? At what point does someone become just Spaniard? At what point do they become French? At what point do they become, or are they able to claim this national identity of being European? That's what their side of the house was always going to restrict and violate. But then understand that even if it's true that players of color on European teams do not exist easily. Even if it's true that they're privy to hate when poor performances happens, the problem is that side proposition makes that infinitely worse. Understand the second thing here is about how this trickles down to immigrants. Europe is soccer galore, right? It dictates culture to some extent. On proposition, they view Black people as people that cannot represent their country, and therefore they begin to view them as not even European. What happens in soccer is what happens in the real world as well. The second thing is that this is very easily weaponized by the far right. Because there are famous people that everyone knows, it becomes so easy for the conservative Tories in the UK and the AfD in Germany and even the Grand Old Party in the US. Comparatively, we had signaling and backlash from national players when racism did happen. That meant less racism was going to occur on our side of the house. When it comes to the impacts, we saw the far right was going to be empowered on their side, and our side led to more integration. The second substantive argument is about player success. The popularity of football in Africa has recently increased. We see this happening post-2010 when the World Cup was held in South Africa. But then, the thing here is that they are unlikely to receive sponsorships from Adidas and Nikes in the short term, so all this sponsorship is money is not just going to flow into African countries. These teams have not been on the circuit as long, and so their development is behind because of different factors that simply can't be manufactured in the short term. Think about things like team chemistry, scouting, having enough people to form a national squad, having Europeans that are willing to go to their countries of dispense, uproot their lives, and then train there for a year. And so investment has to exist on the long term, but that means it's not great for companies, but that means that their side of the house is not great for companies' short-term profit. And so the companies simply will not move. Investment simply will not go to the players that they think it will. Even if there are sponsorships, they're going to follow Mbappe and Bellingham, but those sponsorships will be like their face on jerseys. It's not going to be jets or stadiums or the things that you need to change in order to make sports in Africa necessarily better. Understand that this is detrimental for things like player success, and that on our side of the house, we better solve for this systemic shift. So proud to continue opposing.
Thanks for that speech. Now I invite up Diego to give the second proposition speech.
All right. Let's be clear, side opposition. Regardless of what side people vote for, regardless of who Jude Bellingham plays for, right-wing fascism is on the rise in Europe. The reason why there are right-wing mobs in the UK is not because of what team African players choose to play for. It's because of things like attempted beheadings in the streets. It's because things like a job scarcity. To that extent, then, what is the actual implication? The actual delta in this round isn't so much these massive social impacts, which I don't think that opposition has sufficiently proven to you. The actual delta is the players themselves and how you treat them. Opposition wants to treat them as a social battering ram. It wants you to force them to play for these teams which they themselves, opposition, identify to be racist. They want these players to choose to deal with this, to choose to become political weapons. What we say instead is that if we want to prioritize any unity, it's Pan-African unity. Why ought we have these European players of African descent experiencing all this racism when they could otherwise bolster or African programs? I'll engage with one thing quickly on the framework before engaging with the positive material, defending our own, and then giving our own third substantive argument. The first thing I want to clarify is on the framework. The opposition first speaker did not engage with our framework, which I think is quite detrimental for them in the long run. Because specifically what Ebenezer told you is that on the proposition, the majority of European players of African descent choose to represent their African country of lineage. And on our side, the opposite is the case. What does that mean? Players choose on either side of the house. The difference is, what are they choosing to do? To that extent, then, all the autonomy arguments that they give you simply don't apply. The uniqueness that we gave you on our autonomy claim is that it's about the level of coercion. That is that these players are uniquely coerced into representing European teams, as to where, by comparison, playing for African teams is a far more free and less coerced choice. They didn't engage on the nuance there. Let's then move on to engaging specifically with their arguments. The first substantive argument then is on anti-immigrant sentiment. They talk to you generally about how this does things like justify, like how these players get pushed out of Europe, about this justifies racist nationalist narratives and pits African and European teams against each other. A couple of problems here. First, as I noted in my intro, this is incredibly naive. There are deep structural reasons for why racism exists and manifests within Europe. It is economic, it is social, it is cultural. I don't think that the sports really the tipping point for the extent of these things that happen. For example, look at Jude Bellingham. Right? They're correct. He saved England and put them on their back. I agree. But having right-wing nationalists cheering for Jude Bellingham's name doesn't stop them from being right-wing nationalists. I don't understand the implication of their argument. You can also cross-apply the Freiburg note here on how it's a free choice on either side. The second response that I have is that, like, Erica, like, I don't know what World Cup you're watching, bro, but, like, the World Cup is political already. Like, the African European teams are pitted against each other already. This is a natural result of colonialism and of international politics. To that extent, then, the question is, which of these things are you uplifting? You now have these players having to bear the brunt of this racist backlash, of having English fans who cheer your name one day, but the next day call you a monkey or call you slurs because you didn't score enough goals for them. The question is, which of these things should these players ultimately be exposed to? The third thing I want to note is that the assumption for them is that players, European players of African descent, bolster a sort of diverse European identity. The question that they never answered is why that must be what is bolstered as opposed to bolstering Pan-African, African diasporic identity. This is very crucial. There's a bunch of African culture wars which divide the diaspora, and this impacts us not just on the social day-to-day as far as whose rice is better, but it also impacts what nations collaborate with the other, what nations trade and don't trade, what regional blocks arise within Africa. Given that this is the case, I think that what matters far more is uniting people on the basis of their African identity, even across the diaspora. So there's a crucial burden that the next speaker has to answer to you. Why prioritize Europe above Africa? I don't think they can meet that burden. Given that that is the case, I don't think that there's really a massive impact coming from their anti-immigrant sentiment argument, especially given why all of these European immigrants or why all these immigrants within Europe wouldn't just support these players on their teams of origin now. Like, I think that's probably equally big, right? Like, if I'm a Senegalese in England, I'm probably still going to cheer for, or in France, I'm probably still going to cheer for Ousmane, even if he's now representing Dembele. Their second argument then was essentially a bunch of mitigation on why there aren't that big impacts for these countries. I have two responses here. Our first is that these are like massive players, right? We're talking about Giannis, we're talking about Joel Embiid, we're talking about Kylian Mbappe, we're talking about all these different players that are from a bunch of different countries. I'm sure that the Greeks want Giannis to represent Greece, but I think Nigeria should probably have them instead. Given that this is the case, I think there's two very clear implications, right? There are massive sponsorships. These are very profitable names, and they're probably going to attract a lot of other talent to these teams. That means that Nike, Adidas, I don't know, Patagonia, etc., will all want to sponsor these teams because they have a stake in these teams now succeeding. The second thing to notice is that it probably does benefit infrastructure. There's probably companies themselves, like, I don't know, construction companies or local gymnasiums or like local like road building companies, I don't know, who all see this massive lucrative opportunity and are going to cash in on this opportunity. Given that is the case, it's probably likely there's going to be a lot of investment. The second thing to note is that there's like probably always growing pains to any expansion. Like, if you take their argument to an extent, it's like, no, we should never have new teams in new countries. Like, I don't get it. Like, we take on the growing pains, that's fine. I think it's good to have this expansion. Moving on to our side of the flow, on our principal argument, they say that it violates the freedom of movement. A couple of responses here. Firstly, is that they choose, is that they represent, is that they're going to on either side choose what side they represent. The second response that you can flip their argument, that is that the more that these super elite and talented players lead these European teams, the greater pressure on European teams, national teams, leagues, etc., to reform, to actually hold racists accountable, to kick out racist fans from their crowds and things like this, and it improves the experience for all minorities within Europe. Our third response, it is obviously better for the player. They didn't engage on this ground. I also want to note they didn't actually like engage with the specific argumentation that Ebenezer gave you on our second second argument because it specifically explains that there is now massive interest within these countries in the sport because now it's like, oh my God, Nigeria actually has a chance. Ghana actually has a chance. Sierra Leone actually has a chance, which generates not just local interest in playing the sport. You have coaches coming back to the country to coach. You have leagues and gyms and all these sorts of things which are getting investment to start up. So this impact isn't just on the big professional level. It likely trickles down to the local level. Our third substantive argument then is exactly on this, on the economic impact. There's a couple of mechanisms why this is probably good for the local economy. First is on tourism. Even if games aren't hosted locally, these are massive superstars, Giannis, Embiid, Dembele, etc. People flock just to see them. They try to resell their autographs, etc. People will come across countries, across borders to see them. This brings a lot of money, which is spent on local gifts, on local tolls and taxes, on local food and things like this. For example, the African FIFA tournament generates almost $200 million, and this is just the regional tournament. This is a lot of money that comes in. Second, there's a signaling effect. There's training camps, press releases, recruiting, friendly games, etc., which all attract investment outside of just the sport. Third, it likely translates to infrastructure and creates jobs. You have to build things like roads, hospitals, etc. Fourth, it probably increases political pressure, which activists can take advantage of because they're like, oh, there's a Nigerian friendly cup game taking on. We can use this to talk about the oil presence in our country, etc. And fifth, it probably results in more money being given to local orgs because there's more proximity and exposure. The weighing here is that it benefits the most vulnerable, beggars on the street, and charities who need donations. Whenever Mbappe now gives to your charity, it impacts choice and autonomy because now this money is within African countries as it compared to before towards in European countries. Proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech, and I invite up Alexia to give the second opposition speech.
Proposition traps immigrants into a cycle of perpetual exclusion, locks players out of endless opportunity, and dooms individuals to a fate of being forever chained to an ancient understanding of lineage. They force players into a game of eugenics and make race the prime divider through which governments justify their neocolonial populist policy. If there's one thing you should care about in this round, it's the anti-immigration sentiment that Team Proposition so foolishly tries to support in modern Europe. First, I want to deal with their bullshit principle that is really the only way that they're trying to win on this idea of, oh, players, there's a history of colonialism and their choice is coercive. One, this is untrue. It is quite frankly offensive to say that Lamine Yamal, choosing to play for Spain, the country where he grew up in, whose national anthem he sings, and whose flag he carries, he doesn't want to choose to play for that. But B, it's even more coercive to send them back, right? And this stems from the really nebulous idea of how exactly Proposition wants to decide what the fuck lineage and descent actually means, right? At what point, as Erica told you, does descent actually end up counting, right? Because if it is the case that you're going to go back centuries and centuries, then that's pretty much 60% of English teams and 40% of Spanish teams. But even more so, what Erica told you, the idea that the sentiment of send Mbappe back to Algeria is terrible. I have no idea why this is something that the world should ever have to face, especially when immigrants have had such a difficult time migrating to this country, making
Point of information.
No, thank you, and actually succeeding. But I also want to flip this, right? The idea that this actually harms players. Because yes, it is true that sometimes it's racist for us to blame Jude Bellingham for losing a goal. But the game here is comparative. It is not about whether on one occasion someone might face a racist comment, but whether overall and on net, players are going to face a series of racist ideals and whether that's going to trickle down its cycle. Ultimately, this comes from what Erica tells you, the idea that this screws over immigrants because Proposition exacerbates this anti-immigration dissent, right? Firstly, because of visibility, the idea that you're now actually taking them away from quite literally being seen on the screen when European sports are by far the most viewed in the world. Secondly, because it now breaks down the idea that if you go to a new country, you'll succeed, right? No. Under Proposition, you're landlocked and you're supposed to stay in your country. They're no worries about moving into a European nation where you can make a fame, a career, a success for yourself. But thirdly, it reinforces the idea of black versus white. Because importantly here, when you force or ask these players to go back to their country and play for their African teams, this necessarily means that when you watch the World Cup, it is always going to be the white European team versus the black team. It is always going to be the shitty, crappier team with the crappier facilities having to face all of these fancy European players that get most of the sponsorship, get most of the views, and whose t-shirts kids wear on their back. So I think then the way you should weigh this is not about whether on an individual level players face racism, but whether on a mass scale you have more people viewing black and African players as a piece of scum, as a useless piece of soccer and of sports, rather than an individual who is actually able to put forward and make it diverse. The second thing then that I would like to deal with is the idea on sports and players, right? Because they tell you that ultimately currently you monopolize talent, right? And you crowd out competition. And that's how like you're basically hiring like these black players as trophy ideas rather than for their skill. First, I think it's frankly quite offensive to say that the reason why you're hiring someone like Mbappe is not because you think that he's stellar and amazing and has the capacity to take a team and actually make it historical, but because they just want to crowd out white competition. You hire people because they're genuinely good. But secondly, if players know, as proposition tells you, that these African teams are bad, that they don't have as many facilities, they don't have as prime coaching, they don't have as much equipment, they don't have as many sponsorships, then that necessarily means that it's not true that under proposition, these players will want to choose to go back to their country of lineage. What that means then is that they're more likely in the long term to either not have a career that flourishes at all and leave soccer, or they do initially start this career and then they actually end up fizzling out. On net, we think this is really, really bad. But I also like to flip this, right? The idea that players won't choose to stay for the country of birth. There's multiple reasons why players like Lamine Yamal, like Mbappe, like Giannis Antetokounmpo will actually choose to play in the country that they were born in and choose to move on to, say, the NBA. A, because of facilities and fame and the fact that literally Europe is soccer galore. B, because it's a huge fucking hassle to move your entire life away from your family into the country where, I don't know, your third grandpa was from. But C, there's a sense of national pride. And I think it's frankly quite offensive and hypocritical for a proposition to come up in here and tell you that Lamine Yamal singing the Spanish national anthem has no value, that it is hypocritical, and that he's just being used as a means to an end. If there's anyone that is forcing and coercing players to go back and leave what they believe in, it is proposition that uses the same political anti-immigration narrative that populist politicians use today. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
It is diasporic players themselves that create the justification of putting a fuckload of money into these facilities. If they go somewhere else, why does that justification not just follow them?
You're using the African diaspora as a fucking buzzword that doesn't really mean anything here. Diaspora is all of globalization. People moving and migrating to different parts of Europe, of America, of Latin America, and moving around is literally the idea of migrating for a better life, migrating for you to succeed, and migrating to where your family is. And there's multiple reasons why people move away from their country of lineage, right? Because of war, because of poverty, because of a lack of opportunities. So the fact that these people made a conscious choice to be part of that diaspora, and in that case, you are sending them back, is frankly really, really offensive. What does this mean then? And why is it frankly a lot more harmful on proposition when people are forced to go back to their country of lineage? Firstly, because political parties then use this as an excuse for what they preach. What this means is that when you use something like the most unifying sport in the world, like soccer, like tennis, like rugby, all of that, in order to basically mandate that these people go back, then this means that political parties like the AFD, like the Tories, like the Conservatives can now say, oh, look, you are now sending all of these people back. Maybe we should do this for more. We think, frankly, that this is really, really dangerous because this affects a vulnerable population that is trying really hard to make a life for themselves and to succeed in the world. But also it affects a large amount of people, not to mention the eugenics game that proposition starts to play. At what point does African descent start meaning that you are now going to send them back? At what point does that mean that you're now going to look at a person on the street who's trying to make the football team and you're going to say, well, they're not eligible to play or they shouldn't play here because we're mainly a white team? We think that this is frankly dangerous and perpetuates populist policy if there's any side that supports the diversity of these teams and the success of these players. It is opposition.
Thanks, Alexia, for that speech. Now I invite up Giberson to give the third proposition speech.
All right, just want to make sure I'm audible. All right. Unlike what opposition would have you believe, Aaron Wan-Bissaka did not make a mistake when he chose to represent Congo after a decade of representing England and did not play a single minute of international football. Brahim Diaz did not make a mistake when he decided to represent Morocco after Spain refused to communicate with him. Inaki Williams did not make a mistake when he chose to represent Ghana instead of his birthplace of Spain after his 90-year-old Ghanaian grandfather said it would be a dream to see his grandson wear that jersey before he died. Note panel, this debate was not about neglecting choice. It was always about fighting coercive ones. I've never been prouder to propose. Two areas of clash in this debate. Firstly, who wins on the principle? Secondly, who wins on the practical? Firstly, I want to address this principle claim in this debate. And frankly, at the top of this clash, I can implicate just about every single response that opposition has given you. Their entire engagement with our case is, well, we're just validating claims of colonialism. How? We have never said that we are stripping people of their choice. From first, I think Eb was incredibly clear, right? This debate and this motion has never been about forcing people to give up their identity. We never had to defend that whatsoever.
Why?
This motion simply, no thank you, is a value judgment that if a player has been given the choice between their birth country and between their country of lineage, they should choose the latter. But for the sake of anticipating the opposition bloc, because they're going to collapse on something that we never really argued, I'm going to grant them their absolute best case scenario, in which, I don't know, we just force people in boxes, make them denounce their citizenship and say you have to wear the jersey that your grandfather, that your great-grandfather wore back 300 years ago, and something that you don't necessarily have a claim to. Think about this for a second. Opposition 1 responded to our principle by saying, well, we are just violating freedom of movement because borders are arbitrary. Think about that for a second. If it's true that the lottery of birth contributes, no thank you, to people's identities being arbitrary, then I'm also unclear why there is an issue, which is choosing your country of lineage instead. If it's true on your side of the house that the lottery of birth exists and it is arbitrary that people ended up in a specific country, then it is also arbitrary for them to just choose the country of lineage that they're deciding to align with. Secondarily, we'd be okay, no thank you, with making this occur because the whole point of our principle was that this was never a free choice to begin with. Eb gave you plenty of characterization in the very first speech about how the choice is coerced, how African countries have no leverage, they have no bargaining power, they feel a pressure to conform. And even on your side of the house, at your very best case scenario, in which you manage to prove that this choice isn't coerced, there is an implication that people, players who are on that field, on that pitch, face a degree of discomfort and trauma while they are representing a European country rather than the country of their lineage. And that is something that opposition, frankly, never dealt with, and this was damning for them. Here is the reason why winning this principled argument, no thank you, is incredibly important for this round. Number one, you are encouraging players to be complicit in perpetuating racist and colonialist narratives. I find it a little ironic that a lot of the offense that opposition is trying to glean on is to say, well, we are validating colonialist concerns and we are essentially putting a stamp on people saying, go back to your country of lineage. The problem is, it is the fact that colonialism existed that created those conditions in the first place. So if anything, our side is the only side which corrects for those harms that their side just fundamentally has never dealt with. That was the most important impact of this round, because regardless of if these players decided to wear a French jersey or a Moroccan jersey, it didn't matter if they didn't win a single game in international football. What mattered is that they were not contributing to a complicit system. Sure.
What about the lack of facilities, opportunities, and clout in African nations, as you said, will make Algeria suddenly enticing for Mbappe to move to?
Mbappe himself could literally fund like all of Algerian training facilities, right? But I'll touch on this more in the second part of the practical. On the practical grounds, what I want to say at top here is the vast majority of opposition's offense is on the practical. So if I'm able to undercut their analysis here, they absolutely have no more ground before op block, and I want to be as charitable as possible. The couple areas of clash that's tied to this practical argument here is first on players, second on how this impacts African teams in general, and three, how this impacts anti-immigrant sentiment as a whole. So I want to take this one by one. First, let's talk about players. I think that the only offense that opposition has really gleaned here is to say, well, less developed countries like Morocco just don't have the means to provide facilities for these players. Number one, I think that this is a gross mischaracterization of the status quo. Literally, Morocco debuted the first ever starting 11 in football with players that were born outside of Morocco. And the reason for this is because they recruited and they were able to reach the 2022 semifinals. This was an historic achievement for them. And because of that investment that they were able to make, they can now get additional investment on top of that. So the only the prerequisite to getting more of the investment that opposition themselves is talking about is by having these players commit to these countries in the first place. You're not going to choose to invest in your country if you don't think it's worthwhile, if you don't think you have a chance to qualify for the World Cup because your country hasn't done it for decades upon decades. But if a player like Mbappe, whose transfer fee was hundreds of billions of dollars, decided all of a sudden he now wanted to play for Algeria, that now gives governments an incentive to fund facilities, to fund practice facilities, which then in turn generates more and more money for them in the long run. No, thank you. The only way for them to get that investment that they talked about is by having these players choose to be a part of those countries in the first place. Secondly, I want to talk about African teams. I don't really think we got a lot of engagement here, but the fact of this is simple. There is a monopoly that exists with the talent that people are able to consolidate on their side of the house, because you're able in Europe to spend money on recruiting people into youth academies and things of that sort, whereas in African countries you may not get that as much. And the only way to correct for that is by taking the player who would have been the fifth right back on England's roster and making them the starter on Team Algeria. Because the fact of the matter is, players like, for example, Wan-Bissaka, who literally did not play a single minute on Team England. Maybe it didn't matter for Team England if Team England didn't get Wan-Bissaka any minutes, but it matters for a team like Ghana who could use that talent, could use those players, because that is, to the extent that those players have the talent, that means that those teams could benefit from those players in a way that England would not. The last thing I want to deal with here is this argument about anti-immigrant sentiment. I think that this argument was like really strange, right? I think Diego already gave you plenty of analysis about how there are alternative mechanisms and alternative reasons as to why these things likely are to occur. But if anything, our side is the best way to correct for these things. Because if you want to quench and quell the power of European countries who currently dominate the global landscape of sports, it starts with taking players outside of their birthplace and putting them into their country of lineage. The reason for this is incredibly simple. Morocco does not have the means to negotiate and bargain with large powers and large federations like FIFA if you don't have large players to invest in and players that they can back up and say, well, we have these players, we have the bargaining power. On top of this, they didn't deal with a large amount of our analysis, but that's okay. Remarkably proud to propose.
Thanks for that speech. Now I invite up Artemis to give Opposition 3 speech.
Am I audible and visible and all that hoopla? Cool. Proposition is playing a weird contradictory game of word association. The hill that they're choosing to die on is the idea of a coerced choice. I'm sorry, guys, but a coerced choice is not a choice between two things, one of which is better. A coerced choice is a choice between one thing and nothing else. That's literally what we do when we talk about coerced choice. So for all their argumentation about how African countries tend to have more underdeveloped sporting programs and how, people tend to be pushed into playing for Spain and France and Italy and whatever because they're great and they have football legacies, this does not mean that players are coerced into staying in the country they are born in. This means that they weigh their circumstances and choose that it is better for them to play in Italy, Spain, and France. And mind you, if we want to talk about coerced choice, let's talk about the idea that the far right in Europe is actively telling those players, you're not part of us, you're not one of us, you are not European enough. If we want to talk about coerced choice, their side of the house is the one that coerces players into going back to where they came from, exactly because the color of the skin deems them to not be European enough. The bottom line of all this is that the idea of the coerciveness of the choice is not affected by the motion. The choice that each individual player makes is not coerced, but it is rather free, or it is coerced under both sides of the house. What does matter then is the practical implications of the debate, how this affects the life of the players and how this affects Europe and Africa at large. What I'm going to be talking about then is firstly, the idea of racism and colonialism, and secondly, I'm going to be talking about sports and how good teams are built in general. Let's start then with the idea of racism and colonialism. And I want to very quickly deal with their principle on colonialism because it has been going on for way too long. Number one, I'm sorry, colonialism is more nuanced than European country came to Africa, took African guys, and now African guys play for European country. Yes, colonialism was horrible, but it is part of history. It is part of history to understand that there is diversity in Europe, whether that came because of global migration patterns, globalization, or colonialism. The fact that back in the day colonialism existed doesn't make an African European less European, in the same sense that the fact that a lot of African Americans came to America through the slavery trade doesn't make them less American. It is frankly condescending and patronizing to create a principled argument that argues that people that came through dubious means to a country in which they have been born, raised for years of their life are less citizens than the rest of the people. But also notice that if we take their argument on colonialism and extend it, any person who hasn't been in a country for their entire history of their family isn't deserving to be there. Any person that came to Europe through colonialism isn't European and should go back. Any person that wasn't born in the whatever dynasty in China isn't Chinese enough and should leave. Their idea of colonialism and their principle extended means that all people should go back to their country, that all people should only be natives, and that anyone else is coerced into being there. Frankly, I don't think that proposition stands for a not diverse world. And frankly, I don't think that proposition stands for the idea that everyone should go back to their country. To the extent where they don't stand for that idea, I also think that sending players back to their country of origin instead of their country of birth doesn't do the huge reparations for colonialism that they think it does. But now I want to really fast talk about their African diaspora idea, because they use it as an idea of a magic wand, as a thing that they say of why do we prioritize Europeans over the African diaspora? The African diaspora is exactly that, a diaspora. This means that it is more representative of the history of colonialism and of the African diaspora to have people play in the country in which they're born. Because Lamine Yamal being born in Spain actively shows us that one, Spain does have a colonial past. Two, they have been very dubious to countries like Morocco and Equatorial Guinea. And three, all three of these things can be coincided and can be okay together as long as we continue to remember them and we continue to hold Spain accountable. On the comparative, if we send Lamine Yamal to play for Morocco, the problem that is going to happen is going to push the idea that Spain has done enough by sending Lamine to play for Morocco. They have done enough about their colonial past, and thus they don't need to do any practical reparations, such as paying money, such as continuing to teach the history. All of this is to say that their nebulous ideas about racism, colonialism, and the African diaspora are exactly that, nebulous word association to play Olympics and to shame us into not understanding that one, these people are Europeans and they have the right to choose that they want to play for the country in which they were born. Two, this is better reparation reparations for colonialism, exactly because it continues to remind people that colonialism happened and that it was bad. But notice here that what's more important than all of this is the anti-immigration sentiment that is continuing to build in Europe. Because yes, sports isn't the only reason why anti-immigration exists in Europe. However, the fact that sending Jude Bellingham back to Nigeria will be weaponized by the far right and will affect the daily language of political discussion in Europe means that people are more likely to be racist and to be anti-immigration towards people that come into Europe, whether those are Europeans that were born and raised there or whether those are people from Gaza and Syria that desperately need to go to Europe to escape for a better life. All of this is to say that at the end of the day, if we want to make this a principled game, opposition is far more likely to actually make the life of immigrants better, and this is far more important than any idea that they bring you on sports. But actually, I am a bit of a sport nerd, so I can explain for you why we're better for sports as well. And before I do that, I'm going to take a POI.
Cabo Verde nearly beat Argentina, and like four of their diasporic players played for the US. How do you think that they would do if all of their players came back?
I think that they wouldn't do that great, and I'm going to explain exactly why. Let's talk about sports and how good teams are built. Team opposite proposition wants to talk about how these teams can grow locally, they can grow from sponsorships locally, and if we bring the players back, this is going to be better. Firstly, I want to note that this directly contradicts their argument about coerced choice, because if African nations are that good and have that much money to build a lovely squad from their government, this isn't much of a coerced choice. African nations aren't that far behind, which leaves us to say that African nations cannot in fact on their own build a better team. How can they build a better team? The way that good teams are built are through star players. What does this mean? This means that having a lovely player that is like Lamine Yamal, that plays for Spain, that has the best infrastructure, the best coaches, and the most amount of money, playing on the world stage with a Moroccan flag on his boots, represents Morocco, even if he isn't directly playing for them. This then means that Moroccan children are going to see Lamine Yamal score that lovely goal that's going to have more cover time exactly because he's Spanish and exactly because Spain is winning the World Cup, and they're going to get inspired. This inspiration means that in 20 or 30 years, Morocco is going to have a shit ton of football players that are really good exactly because Lamine Yamal inspired them. This inspiration does not exist on their proposition side of the house, A, because they have less money, and B, because they have less TV time, movie time, whatever you want to call it, for these players to be highlighted, and thus it is less likely that they have these role models. But notice how actually proposition stands for a world in which these European players are taking spots from players that were born in Morocco, from players that were born in Nigeria, from players that were born in Algeria. This means that they actually have less representation of African players on the grand scheme, exactly because they only represent the people from European descent instead of people from the African descent. For all those reasons, exactly because we're better for immigrants in the long term, and exactly because we're better for sports development, clearly we want them to play for the country they were born in.
Thank you for that speech. Then I invite up Erica to give the reply speech.
There's one fundamental question that proposition has still left unanswered in this round, and it's how far do we use someone's ancestry or lineage to determine their identity? The problem is that on side proposition, they literally leverage the colonialism they are advocating against, and then use that colonialism and whatever other circumstance may have led to an individual migrating to validate someone's identity. They tell them that they're not European enough simply because they have African descent. That was the rhetoric that we saw from the AFD. That was the rhetoric we saw from the Grand Old Party. And that was the rhetoric that we saw from right-wing populism that is rising across Europe in this quell. In this speech, a couple of things. First, some clarifications on the framing level. Then I'm going to evaluate the practical and the principle to tell you why we've still won today's debate. But on this framing level, understand that Guiberson is right. This is not a policy motion, so they still have the fiat of choice. That's why there's never any contest to that in my speech, because understand, yes, it's a believes motion, you have the fiat of choice, but because it's a believes motion, you believe that Lamine Yamal's identity can and ought to be defined by his African ancestry. That was the clash that we're giving you that they failed to engage in. We thought that belief was actually a lot more harmful than whatever policy they will or will not pass on their side of the house. And the reason why is because that belief is so easily weaponized by the far right. And that leads us to the second clarification on the framing level. I promise you, that even if you believed that opposition had some principle or moral level violations, the fact that on side proposition, this kind of policy or this kind of belief will always be easier manipulated and leveraged by the far right is going to violate whatever idea of colonialism they tell you we're harming. Understand that if the far right gets to leverage this idea that someone's identity or someone is not European enough if they have African lineage, it's so much easier for them to buy into that and to leverage that because of visibility and because of these popular African players than it is to just say like, oh, they're uniting Pan-Africa and they're supporting the African diaspora. Even if you thought that those principal harms existed, the fact that you proposed this motion was always going to harm the practical level of things like immigration, of anti-immigration and of African existence in Europe in the first place. The third thing is just on contradictions that pretends don't exist. When Diego tells you that the 4 players from the African diaspora that competed for Argentina would have benefited Cabo Verde if they played for that team, understand that they literally tell you time and time again from their framing that it's going to be the 5th best players going to these teams. But all of a sudden, the Argentinian players in the World Cup are going to be playing for Cabo Verde. Remember, they never explained the incentive analysis. They never told you that suddenly these players are going to go play for these African teams. They never explained to you why that shift was going to happen and why that shift was necessarily better. On the principle level, understand that the idea of coercion didn't even exist. I think Artemis perfectly explained that to you. But secondly, that any person that through hundreds of years was from a different country, they have still not earned their European nationality on their side of the house. They continue to violate that. On our side of the house, we saw that immigrant and immigration and integration was more widely accepted, which is why we always fulfilled the principle on a much better level. But then on the practical level, understand that the visibility they never accessed on their side of the house was the same reason why African teams weren't actually going to develop better. The fact that visibility would not exist for them meant that just because Mbappe went to Algeria didn't mean that Algeria is now suddenly going to win the World Cup in the next year. Understand that they never engaged with this short-term analysis and they'll never access the long term. I've never been so proud to continue opposing this motion.
Thanks for that speech. Now I invite up Eb to give the proposition reply.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. One moment to get the doc situated. Cool. All right. This is what the comparative looks like for side opposition in this debate. You have diverse faces of empire. You have Black people playing for empire, legitimizing claims that England is supposedly diverse and past its racist history. On our side, Africans support African countries while still having some modicum of connection to their birthplace that they really love the Brits that much they can just play in club. Op tries to reverse woke us and pretty much say, no, you're proving the racist right. The problem is centering the paradigm of racist in the first place, right? Let's talk about the classroom debate. Before that, I want to respond to the 2 new arguments they bring up in third, which is illegal, by the way, but whatever, right? 2 things here. First, if their argument about having these diaspora players in these countries, incentivizing education was true, the USA would be the most anti-racist society ever. This is obviously just not true. The second thing though is that they generally think if a Black player plays for Argentina, they're going to tell them about legalized racial whitening. This literally doesn't make any sense, right? Second thing, as far as the crowding out effect that they talk about, right? This doesn't respond to any of the practical material we already did. These players themselves are the main attractive point. So if they go to different countries, then a slew of investment follows them so they can just expand the capacity they have to have different players in the first place. All this was literally already in case. Let's talk about the 2 classroom debate. First thing on the player's experience, which is by far the most important argument, because literally every other argument in this round just completely skirts past the fact that the player is at the center of the experience, the playing experience, what the player is doing, what benefits the player. Who cares about the principle? Who cares about the prag? Whichever side explains to you why the player has a better experience of playership literally wins the debate. First thing to note as far as characterization, what does the state of African unity look like? Because after listening to Op Bench, you would literally think that the continent is full of deer and headlights, right? First, there's very clearly strong pan-African unity in the status quo. Things like the Pan-Hell Alliance, just politically and socially. We've already also told you about the fact that there's increasing support for African sports because of things like historical finishes in the World Cup, and there's an increasing focus focus on this very thing. It's really clear that opposition just views these players as a prop in their anti-racist campaign. Let's actually talk about the player. One, we explained to you there's a qualitative difference in racism. Even if players face more racism on our side, which is the weighing, they have better support systems because the fact of racism alone isn't the full breadth of harm. People can't register what a microaggression is. The second thing, though, this literally eviscerates their case. Europeans don't say they're racist. They'll just like look at you and say, "Oh, look at all the token immigrants we have." Their own mechanism, literally prevents accountability from happening on their side. Last thing to note, though, riddle me this: what world do you think creates more accountability against racism? Unified Pan-African teams with the most prolific stars in the world, or diverse teams where Black players are scapegoated when they fail and venerated when they succeed? Second thing to note very clearly on the principle, not even the winning, like the most like impactful argument in the round, but we'll talk about it either way, right? The original principle in justice that we specified to you was very clear. The original exploitation that happened has undermined Africa's ability to keep up with the Western world and has delegitimized them fundamentally, right? The principle here is super, super duper clear. It couldn't be any clearer, right? Restoring African legitimacy matters a lot more than being scapegoated by racists who already think less of you, right? There's no significant delta on what like the AFD thinks about Black people because the AFD is racist prior to any of this happening in the first place, right? There's no correlation, there's no causation between these things, right? What is most important, though, is restoring the legitimacy of African players themselves and the choices and decisions they are able to make. And notice, the opposition completely defames the ability of these players to make choice, completely coddles them, is completely paternalistic to them by saying, "Oh, no, you don't have the ability to make this choice. Like, you just stay with Europe, right? Like, be a good little boy, right?" Like, this is absolutely ridiculous, right? On our side, we actually legitimize the choice of these African players if they so choose to represent these countries and restore the historical amount of legitimacy that has been lost by African countries writ large on a global stage as a result of huge and massive effects of brain drain that have taken away local talent and completely sidelined these African players and African nations in the global competitive arena. For all those reasons, very, very.
Thanks, Eb, for that speech. And thank you, everyone, for a fantastic debate. I hope you guys really enjoyed. I was very entertained, and I hope you all are inspired as well. I'm very inspired, even though I'm also retired. I'm going to send you all to the chat where you'll see that a couple minutes